So here's our list of sponsors that we'd like to thank. And in particular, we'd like to put out a special thank you to the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association and Reconstructing Judaism for advertising this webinar, and Rabbi Deborah Waxman for being our Darshanit, who we'll introduce later. So I'd like to pass it to Jane.
Good afternoon. I am Jane Susswine, president of the Mordecai Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of 3 webinars commemorating Kaplan's 40th yahrzeit and the 90th anniversary of the publication of Judaism as a Civilization. The speakers will reflect on what remains revelatory in the 21st century in Mordecai Kaplan's thought. Caitlin Hayes, our VP of Programming, will now introduce our stellar speakers. Thank you, Caplan.
Hi there. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our speakers for today's webinar on Kaplan's 40th yahrzeit. We have a number of panelists today who are going to be talking about what remains revelatory in Kaplan's thinking. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Arnie Eisen, who served as the chancellor at JTS, and he is currently a member of its faculty, and he teaches courses in modern Jewish thought. Arnie is the author of 5 books, dozens of scholarly articles, and hundreds of essays, blogs, and commentaries on the weekly Torah portions. He is currently completing work on a volume of personal theology entitled Seeking the Hiding God. David Ellenson is currently the Chancellor Emeritus at the Anna Gransel Professor Emeritus of Jewish Religious Thought at Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Institute of Religion. He served as director of the Schusterman Center of Israel Studies at Brandeis from 2015 to 2018. And he is also currently Professor Emeritus of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis. Following the tragic death of Rabbi Aaron Pankin, Ellenson was called up to be the interim president of the Hebrew Union College. And his latest book, American Jewish Thought Since 1934, was co-authored with Michael Marmer and was also published through Brandeis University Press in 2020. Rabbi Nancy Fuchs Kreimer, PhD, is an associate professor emerita at Religious Studies, and she is the founding director of the Department of Multi-Faith Studies and Initiatives at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, where she was also ordained in 1982. She holds a master's degree from Yale Divinity School and a doctorate from Temple University. She has support from the Henry Luce Foundation, where she's pioneered innovative community-based learning opportunities for rabbinical students and their peers of other faiths. Some of her notable projects include dialogue retreats for emerging Muslim and Jewish leaders, Cultivating Character, A Conversation Across Communities, and Kaplan's Chaplaincy for a Multi-Faith World. Nancy is also a past president of Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association. She's a founding board member of the Interfaith Center of Philadelphia, Shoulder to Shoulder of the Islamic Society of North America, and the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom. And lastly, I'd like to introduce you to our Darshanit, who is the wonderful president of the Reconstructionist Judaism, Rabbi Deborah Waxman. She is president and CEO of Reconstructing Judaism, and she is a noted scholar of the history of the Reconstructionist Jewish movement.
Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to be with you. I want to ask for your indulgence 2 times over. The first is to focus on the parsha that we read for this past Shabbat, Chayei Sarah. And the second reason is because it was my bat mitzvah portion. 44 years ago, yesterday on the Jewish calendar and next Friday on the secular calendar, I climbed onto the bima of a small upstart conservative shul outside of Hartford, Connecticut, where I led the services from Psukei de Zimra all the way through Musaf, and I chanted the Maftir Aliyah from the Torah, and then I chanted the Haftarah. I'm going into that much detail because it was quite unusual for the conservative movement to do that much at that period of time. This was only 2 years after the conservative movement voted to allow congregations to decide, and not all of them did, to grant women full religious equality, a full 27 years after the Society for the Advancement of Judaism voted in that direction. And up until that fall at our little shul, all of the Benot Mitzvah had been Friday nights, and where the girls led Friday night services and only chanted Haftarah. So as what I did suggests, this was a congregation that was ultimately deeply, deeply influenced by Mordecai Kaplan and the circle gathered around him. Certainly in the adoption, very immediately within the conservative movement of women's full religious equality. And then in doing that, the full implementation of equal opportunities and equal expectations for the girls. And even as that was the shul that helped to launch me on the path toward the rabbinate, and that I was very active in the Connecticut region of the United Synagogue Youth, I never heard the name Mordecai Kaplan or the term Reconstructionist Judaism until I was in college. Now, this is not inevitable. Had I grown up a half an hour down the road in New Haven, perhaps I might have been a member of the synagogue led by a Caplan disciple, Stanley Rabinowitz. Or had I gone to Camp Ramah, I might have been trained with these kinds of skills early on. Both locations that were very, very deeply influenced by Caplan. But I want to raise this up on the occasion of noting Kaplan's 40th yahrzeit to talk about the complexity of legacy and even how Caplan himself made it complex. It's widely known that Caplan preferred Reconstructionism to be an approach, and I'm sure our speakers will talk more about this, that I'm looking at notes from 1942 where he talked about it wanting it to be additive or an enthusiasm like early Hasidism. And in 1944 at a Reconstructionist gathering, he argued that Reconstructionism was no mere school of thought, no mere denomination, no mere religious order, but rather was a dynamic movement, not in Judaism, but of Judaism, that sought to forecast the direction in which Judaism must evolve and to facilitate that evolution. It is likely that Caplan was focusing in this way because there were adherents who were pushing hard for a more militant and more structured organization of this movement. And as the story suggests, the tension is ever present in the immediate, back in the 40s and when that debate was going on, and in the evolution about how ideas and their implementation may change. The advocates for institutionalization argue that the risk was that Kaplan's influence would be obscured the way it was for me and my community, or that these ideas would be lost. And I think especially right now about how Caplan articulated a rejection of chosenness, which feels ever more resonant to me in this moment when Israel is led by a coalition government that espouses Jewish supremacism. So I want to return with one more direct I want to finish up with one more direct reflection on the Parsha. In what I'm sure Mordecai Kaplan would consider a failing of this lovely little shul where I became bat mitzvah, I was educated to perform the service and to chant meticulously, but no one ever instructed me on the meaning of the prayers or the structure of the service, and no one thought to go over the Parsha with me. So as a 12-year-old, I was vastly perplexed. I was really confused that this Parsha that was called Chaye Sarah, the life of Sarah, began with Sarah's death. It simply did not make sense to me. As an adult, it was as an adult that I began to learn all of those things, first through the Chavurah movement, and then at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, two institutions also deeply shaped by Mordecai Kaplan, the former with little recognition or acknowledgement, and the latter explicitly. 44 years later, the intertwining of life and death feels so much closer to me, so much more resonant. And I am grateful to have this longstanding connection to a parsha that is in fact bookended by death, beginning with Sarah's and closing with Abraham's. A parsha that in between includes reconciliation and cooperation and even love. We're gathered today to mark a meatily significant yahrzeit of a gadol, a gibor of the 20th century Jewish life. When we take this time to remember, when we remember our ancestors, our parents, our teachers, our guides, we bear witness to the lives they lived. We find our own pathways to live out their rich and complex legacies, and we act to ensure that their memories are a blessing. We are all heirs to Mordecai Kaplan's visionary leadership, and we are surely blessed by his life, by his work, by his legacy, and by his memory.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. We're now going to be passing the baton off to Dr. Eric Caplan, who is a vice president and academic advisor of the Caplan Center and an associate professor of contemporary Judaism and Jewish education at McGill University in Montreal. And it's noteworthy to say that Dr. Eric Caplan is currently working on a volume on Caplan soterics. Eric?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Deborah. And it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to see all of you and to play some role in this wonderful program that we have. Just want to say, as you're probably seeing in the chat, Margie has just put in there a comment to the extent that if you have any questions or comments for David or Arnie or Nancy, please put them in the chat as the program is unfolding. At a couple of points, I will pull out from the chat with the thank of Jeffrey Shine, with the help of Jeffrey Shine, who's going to be monitoring the chat on our behalf and pulling out questions from it. But because we're a very large group of people, relatively speaking, coming to basically 140 people, we will try to get to as many questions as possible, but we're obviously not going to be able to get to all questions that are posted. When the four of us got together a couple of weeks ago to kind of go through this webinar and think about how it would unfold, it became very clear that David, Nancy, and Arnie need very little help from me in moving the conversation forward, because they are both very knowledgeable, very comfortable with each other, and very used to, talking in these types of frameworks. So I'm going to moderate very lightly. But one thing that I did want to do before I throw out the first question is I just wanted to do a quick screen share, and I just wanted to show you a quote from the Caplan Diaries that I think kind of sets the tone for today in different ways. And it's from the unpublished parts of the diaries from October 1973, as you see here. And I'll just read it for those of you who are not connected to a screen at the time. As the notation of the two dates in the margin indicates, I am in a somewhat panicky state of mind about myself, about the Jewish people, and about human life as a whole. The war, which broke out 5 days ago on Yom Kippur at 2 p.m., simultaneously from Syria in the north and Egypt in the south, probably accounts for my present state of mind. I know that I have nothing of the physical courage that is essential to experiencing a sense of contentment, to say nothing of happiness. The amount of suffering and misery that abounds in the world is something I cannot forget, so that even in times of peace, I never experience a sense of happiness. The thought of war in any part of the world makes me miserable, And to find myself in the very midst of it, as I do these days, because he was living in Israel at the time, means being, in addition, overcome by a streak of physical cowardice, which I have never been able to eliminate from my innermost being. Thank God that I am free from moral cowardice. And I think that's partly why we're here in such large numbers, because we're talking about an individual who was definitely free of moral cowardice, and somebody who could say, the thought of war in any part of the world makes me miserable, and had that type of level of deep engagement. So I'll stop the screen share and throw out the first question to David, Arnie, and Nancy, which is, I know that each of you has a long history of engaging with Caplan. So if you could, to start off, share with us how you got involved in Caplan, what about him was compelling to you then, and what has remained compelling to you as the years have started. And maybe David could begin.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Eric. I'm very appreciative, very honored to be here, especially with Nancy and Arnie, and to have so many good friends. Deborah, Yasher Koach on a beautiful Devar Torah. It is always wonderful to learn a bit more about you and your life. And obviously, in many ways, I feel very close to the Reconstructionist movement in relationship to Rabbi Caplan himself in 1972. So a bit over 50 years ago, I was a first-year student at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. And in my first months there, we were blessed because Rabbi Caplan came and taught us. I was elated at the opportunity to study with him. It was a weekly seminar, and I'll never forget, and I think I mentioned this to Nancy, Arnie, and Eric when we spoke. In the very first session, he concluded it with the following words. He said, I want to quote a passage to you, Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. And then he asked all of us if we could translate that line. And of course, people said, cause us to return to you, O God, and we shall return, renew our days as of old. And I'll never forget, Dr. Caplan went, not a good translation. Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, reconstruct our days as of old. So it was my most significant, I would say, face-to-face encounter with Rabbi Caplan. I had always admired Caplan very, very much. I will confess I'd grown up in an Orthodox background, and Caplan's whole approach in Judaism as a civilization, his notion of folkways and sancta, all of those things appealed to me very, very much. His stance on chosenness, i.e. his rejection of that, the universalism that marked his thought, while there was always the love of particularism, all of these things appealed to me very, very greatly. And I won't go into this today, but I'd say I came that close to attending the RRC and not HUC, but for a variety of reasons, I ended up at the College Institute and not the RRC, which had really just begun at that point. I think what I most appreciate about Rabbi Caplan, and I bring it up in relationship to the events today, there was an article in 1973 in Shema magazine by Emil Fackenheim, the great Jewish philosopher, and Rabbi Fackenheim made the point about what it was he most appreciated about Mordecai Kaplan. And Fackenheim made the point that he said, Kaplan understood a truth that I failed to understand years before. He said Kaplan understood the centrality that had to be accorded to Jewish peoplehood and the emphasis that had to be placed upon it. And I think for myself, it is that emphasis on Jewish peoplehood in the midst of an approach to Judaism that affirms the universal ethical qualities of our tradition. And I know we'll get into elements of this as we go forward. That is really most significant to me. And I would say that Professor Fackenheim, in my view, correctly identified what was so central to Kaplan. And as Deborah put it before, this constitutes, I think, the most significant part of his legacy personally for me at this moment. So I'll leave it with that in my introductory remarks. And Eric, I turn it over to you to call on Nancy or Arnie.
Let's go with Nancy.
Hi, everybody. So there's an Arabic proverb, Yom Asal, Yom Basal. Some days are like honey and some days are like onions. And I think most of us would agree the last 6 weeks, well, they feel like 6 years, but actually 6 weeks have been more onion days than honey days. So, I don't have to say the frightful war, the rising anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bigotry in our country, the polarization in our community. So in the midst of these onion days, I have really appreciated the opportunity to prepare for this webinar because I had little glimmers of light as I got to dig back into Caplan. And as you all know, that's endlessly fascinating. And the other thing I want to say before I even start is that without Mel Skuld, I don't know what I would do. I probably wouldn't even be here today. Mel Skuld made teaching Caplan engaging again to me. I found my students way more interested in the Caplan of the diaries than I had ever found them in the Caplan of the writings. And the passion he poured into those diaries, it was just so profound. So Mel, if you're there, thank you. Hi, Mel. So I want to just say something about Caplan and what was revelatory about him, because actually that's what I was thinking to say. My personal story isn't that interesting. I grew up Reconstructionist. I didn't know any better. But the reason that I think he was revelatory was that he believed in his full brain that Jewish civilization had something to contribute, that the riches of Jewish civilization could make life more meaningful for Jews, for Americans, for humankind. But I found out in the diaries that he was also incredibly pessimistic if a rich Jewish civilization could actually flourish in America. And in 1930, he wrote this great thing in his diary. He said, I feel like a polar bear on an ice floe that is drifting into warmer zones as he watches with growling impotence the steady dwindling of his home. And he felt that way quite a bit. In 1933, he described a Shabbat dinner. My daughter Naomi made some remark justifying the communist opposition to the Jewish settlement of Palestine on the ground that it would crowd out the poor Arabs. This roused my indignation. I concluded that if all my efforts to build up Jewish life with a home background such as my children have, they could even for a moment question the legitimacy of the Jewish hope to find a home in Palestine, what can we expect of the thousands of young people who have never had a chance to learn the high ethical and spiritual values latent in Judaism? So that was where he was so worried. And what I wanted to say as I thought about this during these last few weeks was that I read over the entering bios of the this year, 2023 class at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And I thought that this growling polar bear might have been surprised and also kvel. So here are these smart, passionate people, social justice, the arts, spirituality. These are people who could go to top law schools. Some of them already have done that. And they want to serve the Jewish people. And they've worked for and volunteered in all sorts of organizations that didn't even exist when I went to rabbinical school. Rabbis for Human Rights, Avodah, Jewish Service Corps, Bend the Ark, Repair the World, Mazon, Yiddish Music Troupe, Gay Rights, Jewish environmental organizations. There were 2 of those. Queer Talmud, Jewish Women Archives, Arts Fellowships, Jewish Theater, Jewish Mindfulness Meditation organizations. Okay, you get the idea. So, are these people coming here because of anti-Semitism? Are they coming here for nostalgia for their Bubby and Zeta? Not most. They want to spend their lives building up that ice flow Kaplan worried about because they see in Jewish civilization in ways that Kaplan could not have imagined. I probably couldn't have even imagined in 1983. But in his most visionary moments, what he saw and was true, that identification with the Jewish people can be a path for salvation, personal and communal. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that, Nancy. Arnie?
I'm going to pick up exactly where Nancy just left off, because Eric, when we talked about this session, and I looked forward to the pleasure of talking with my 2 old friends, David and Nancy, I reflected on Kaplan's diaries, and the thing that jumps out at you from the diaries is how lonely he was. And we saw this on Nancy's quotation there about the polar bear on the ice floe, and he didn't have a lot of company. He was so forward-looking. He was ahead of his time, and it must have been incredibly frustrating to him. He really was a voice crying in the wilderness a lot of the time. And what's true of my generation and the generations that have come after us is exactly the opposite. I never had the sense of loneliness in my generation. I had the sense that I was part of a generation of teachers and students who were trying to pursue Kaplan's goal of revitalizing Judaism in America and elsewhere. And we had each other to draw upon. I had so much intellectual and spiritual and moral, I would say moral companionship. And then, as Nancy said, our students are part of a generation which is even more diverse, but I think even has more solidarity around this goal of revitalizing the Jewish people and revitalizing Judaism. So this is a truly wonderful development. I first got to Caplan, I think, early. I was a teenager, and my rabbi, unlike Deborah's, I think, my rabbi had the wisdom to take the teenagers out from services, which we were bored by, and to introduce us to the riches of modern Jewish thought, contemporary Jewish thought. And I remember reading Caplan and reading Heschel and reading Buber as a teenager and get excited by them. And then jumping ahead years later, I have to say that I owe my dissertation topic to Caplan. I was trying to write about American Judaism and find some purchase for an intellectual history of American Judaism between, say, the 1930s and the 1970s. And I found out from a survey of what was being written that more was being written about the chosen people idea than about anything else. By far, this was before the Holocaust seized center stage in Jewish thought. And that was partly because Jews were being accused of being responsible for racism, ironically, that people were saying, well, Nazism is the Jews' fault because you have this idea of the chosen people, et cetera, et cetera. So you founded racism. There was that. Jews were trying to make it in America, and it was a burden, not a blessing, to be interpreted as saying, well, we're better than you, to the people we wanted to join. But the main reason why chosenness was being talked about by everybody was that Caplan insisted on so often about getting rid of the idea and dropping it from the prayer book and substituting other things for it. So I spent the years of my dissertation writing engaged full steam ahead with Mordecai Kaplan, and maybe later I'll be able to talk about the meeting I had with Caplan in Jerusalem in 1976 when I talked to him about my dissertation and what was going on. But let me say that for me, then as now, the great gift of Caplan is his attempt to save Jewish civilization in America and beyond America. I often tell my students when I teach this wonderful book, Judaism as a Civilization, that the table of contents, I'm holding up one of my many tattered copies of the book. The table of contents is a great achievement in the corpus of modern Jewish thought. I think it's unparalleled elsewhere. I mean, let's look at what the factors in the crisis are, and let's look at what the factors of conservation are, and let's look at what people have proposed until now as a way of solving the problem. And now I'll tell you what's wrong with those ways of doing it. And now I'm going to give you my idea, and then he spells out the consequences, the implications of his idea. It's beautifully organized, and it's daring. Talk about moral courage. I just want to point out here that under factors of conservation, what he mentions as the major environmental factor of conservation, that is, what element outside Judaism itself is mainly responsible for keeping Judaism going, he tells us it's anti-Semitism. This was the 1930s. And all of us have this very much in our minds today. Is the uptick in anti-Semitism going to be something that draws Jews back, or something that pushes Jews away? Is this going to be a revitalizing force for Judaism? Are we going to think differently and creatively? Or is this going to deaden us and make us draw the wagons into a circle and go on automatic pilot? I think the strategy in Judaism as a civilization, if I could sum it up in one sentence, in one thought, is that Kaplan wants to change the question from why be a Jew to why not be a Jew. If you could surround people with Jewish experiences that were positive and meaningful and joyful and rich, if you could put the art on the wall, have the art on the walls be Jewish art, if you could have the music in the home be also Jewish music, the symbols that guide people, the Jewish social organization, the social setting, the recreational activities be Jewish, if Judaism could change from a leisure time activity that you do once in a while to something that defines you as a human being, then you could change the question from why be Jewish to why not be Jewish. And I just want to say one more thought here. What makes Caplan so relevant and revelatory is that along the way, in the course of this book, he sees the deep problems that beset the attempt to do this. And I just want to name two of them here at the beginning. We'll be talking about them more as we go along. One of them is named on page 215 and 216 of Judaism as Civilization. He says that we're going to live in two civilizations, Judaism and America. But he has the honesty to say that if you want to live Judaism as a dominant civilization, there is only one option in the world right now. And that one, he says, go to Palestine, which he did for a while in the 1930s and thought of staying and decided not to. He said, if you want to live Judaism as a coordinate or equal civilization, your only option is Simon Dubnov's ideal, which never came into reality, of some kind of ethnic and cultural autonomy in Europe. And then he says, straight out here on page 216, the third zone of Jewish life would include countries like France and America. Notice he puts them together, where the only civic status recognized by the state is that of individual citizen, and where Judaism can survive only as a subordinate civilization. This is a great, as far as I'm concerned, a great sociological insight. If you're 2% of the population, why persuade the 2% to go along with the 98% unless you can create what the sociologist Peter Berger called plausibility structures that make Judaism compelling, even though it's only the 2% and not the 98%. And that was Kaplan's lifelong mission. That's what he wanted to do, to make Judaism so plausible and so compelling that people were going to choose it. Well, he recognized one other issue that we still confront, and this one is on page 196 or so, when he's talking about the constituent elements of Judaism, and he says that we've got to make page 200, 296, 294, we have to introduce a measure of involuntarism. Involuntarism. A person is a member of a nation not by choice, but by virtue of the pressure of the cultural group into which they're born. That pressure is exerted in the first instance through the family. This is a version of the problem I mentioned a moment ago. If Jews are given free choice, let's put it starkly, and there are billions of dollars being spent on advertising on TV every day to get us to choose certain consumer goods, and the movies and TV and everything else that's streaming at us is sending a message that's not particularly Jewish. How is it that we're going to get people to choose Judaism over and over and over again, to choose it for themselves and choose it for their kids. And Caplan recognizes that free choice is not completely free because there's all these other factors involved. And so if you want to get people to choose, there has to be this measure of involuntarism. There has to be some kind of social sanction involved. There has to be some kind of pressure to make people want to go in this direction rather than the other direction. It's a moment where Mordecai Kaplan is rebelling against his own commitment to this liberalism, to this freedom. He knows we got to have something involuntary here. People have to feel something that's beyond free choice. Dare we say they have to feel obligated. They have to feel commanded. And that, to me, is the heart of the problem that we've got right now. How do we get people to feel obligated, responsible to choose this wonderful thing called Judaism?
Yeah, thank you. And so I imagine, David and Nancy, that you have things both to respond to Arnie and to each other from earlier. So if you could just unmute and jump in.
I'm willing to go, but Nancy, why don't you go first?
Well, thank you. I just wanted to see, it's so funny, as Arnie and I really came at this from two very different ways. You were talking about how can we make it more, may possibly even have obligation involved. And I was saying, from where I sit, it seems like people without the obligation, without this lack to be, not, you can't intermarry, none of that. All the things, by the way, intermarriage was one of the things he talks about. Without a lot of the things that we were worried about and we used to discuss at great length, we still see people coming to us. And I find that the notable thing. There are 24 young people in a conversion class at a very left-wing Reconstructionist congregation in West Philadelphia. People are coming to us. And I think this is where I was going to go, but I tried to be shorter in my introductory remarks. I think it has to do with Kaplan's theology, or his approach to religious thought opened up a space for people who don't want to think about God in the most traditional way, in a theistic, personal theistic, not supernatural way. It opened up a space for them to be able to find spiritual practice, to find meditation, to find whatever kind of chanting, meditation, whatever spiritual practice worked for them. They were able to bring that through into Judaism because of the liberatory nature of the Reconstructionist approach to God. And I think I learned all this from Art Green, so I'm not going to just bloviate here. I'm going to throw out Art Green, and that way people can argue with somebody who actually wrote all this down, and I think is a pretty smart person. And what he said in the 90s was that Neo-Hasidism and Reconstructionism were good partners. They were kissing cousins. I teach at the Aleph ordination program now. I'm about to begin my 4th semester. And I find teaching Aleph students in the renewal movement very simpatico. And what Art Green said, and then I'll stop and let David go, the concept of God offered by Hasidism is not simply the projected father figure rewards people for good behavior. This is a shift. It's a way of thinking about the world in which it's not, God is not a being, but God is an aspect of being. And this shares with Reconstructionism the transcendence of conventional theism and the opportunity to allow people to move into thinking of God, not so much idea word, as Caplan put it, but life word, toward experience, toward what they actually know to be true from their own lives. And I'll just, one last thing, this is Caplan, not Art Green. He said, when I say God is a process that makes for salvation, I am not giving you a definition of God. I am telling you where to look for the experiences in your life that are godly, that your ancestors called God. That's what I have to say about that.
I'm very appreciative of what both Nancy and Arnie said, and I will confess that maybe this speaks to my Reform Reconstructionist orientation. I'm not as oriented towards notions of, in quotes, obligation. I think one of the things that's interesting is that in Judaism as a civilization, part of his prescience was, again, here, Kaplan does talk about the reality of intermarriage. In other words, in terms of Jews living in a subordinate civilization, to quote Arnie, he fully anticipated that Jews would intermarry, and he thought that the test of Jewish civilization would in large measure be, could the Jewish partner in such unions be sufficiently committed to Judaism in terms of its evolving character to bring the non-Jewish partner, children that would be born from the marriage, members of the family, into the orbit of the Jewish people. He doesn't necessarily mean conversion, but he does mean the reality of what it would be to live within the ambit of Jewish life. And I think Kaplan, again, was quite prescient in this, and that Kaplan really has laid out in the way that Arnie indicated as well, what the problems of modern Jewish thought are. I think one of the interesting things is the strength of Jewish peoplehood that remains. Here I think of the writings not of Kaplan completely, but the writings of my teacher Jacob Katz from Hebrew University, who wrote a book called Out of the Ghetto, and it analyzed the Jewish entry into the Western world from 1781 to 1883. But part of what Katz notes at the end, and I think Kaplan speaks to this, even though, of course, he wouldn't have read Katz's book when he wrote Judaism as a Civilization, is that he said the amazing thing is that when you consider how Jews have entered into the life of the Western world, particularly in places like France, Britain, and England, you might have anticipated that Judaism would simply atrophy and die. But he said the reality is that Judaism has really not done that, that there remains a strong commitment. And when Nancy describe the nature of the students who are entering the RRC this year, I think it is profoundly important that it is not anti-Semitism that has motivated these people to make Judaism the center of their life and to seek a life of Jewish leadership within our community, but the vibrancy of what it is that a Jewish community can offer. And Kaplan certainly understood how it is that the people themselves and Jewish peoplehood could speak to these issues. It is clear for someone like me, the non-supernaturalistic vision that Kaplan put forth remains extremely, extremely attractive. Quite frankly, the rationalism of Kaplan is something that appeals to me. I never did this. My close friend and classmate, David Teutsch, when he was president of the RRC, also edited Kol HaNeshama, the Reconstructionist prayer books. As someone, namely myself, who regards myself in large measure as a kind of Orthodox Kaplanian, I probably haven't evolved as much as the movement has. I was really quite upset when they put in, even as an alternative, the traditional Aleinu into the prayer book. I know it's not the major version, Gersah, that's put forward, but I will confess that for myself, I thought, boy, what would Rabbi Kaplan say about this? And because when I was president of HUC and our stance on Zionism had changed so much from the classical reform anti-Zionist posture, and I would get letters constantly complaining to me, what would Kaufman Kohler say, who was a notorious anti-Zionist and fired every Zionist faculty member from the faculty of the Hebrew Union College. I did not write to David nor register a protest because I didn't want to be that person for him. But I think what Kaplan understood, and I go back to even my opening remarks, was the warmth the Jewish community can provide. The last point I'd make, and I know I wasn't going to say this in the beginning, but Mel's work in regard to the diaries of Kaplan have been an incredible, incredible treasure trove. And part of what I learn about Kaplan from this, and I think this is part of the reason why he is so loved, is how human he is. Arnie mentioned this in his remarks. Nancy did as well. But you see the insecurities that would mark Rabbi Kaplan. You understand the loyalties that he had specifically to the Jewish Theological Seminary, which I think prevented him from taking certain steps in life in regard to the denominationalism that Deborah alluded to at the very beginning of her remarks today. He has one remark, if I remember it correctly. He says, it's Friday night. I'm 53, 54 years old. I still have not, as he put it, freed myself from many of the constraints of my childhood, and I'm writing on my diary. One of the girls, he said, just came in. They caught me writing on a Friday night. I dropped my pen or pencil very, very quickly and, just said to my daughter, oh, I'm reading from the diary, and she is a good and dutiful daughter who did not want to embarrass me. Made no other remark about what it was that I was undoubtedly doing. I find such statements on Kaplan's part where he indicates how difficult it was to liberate himself from, I'll call them the folk ways of his childhood, just very, very endearing. But I also think it points to the fact that there is a depth in Judaism and Jewish tradition and the power of community, particularly democratically constructed as Kaplan envisioned it, that is very, very powerful and continues to draw people into the Jewish fold. And I think a great deal of the vitality in modern Jewish life and the ability or the attempt to reconstruct it and renew it is owed to Kaplan and his vision.
Thank you. That's very rich. Arnie or Nancy, do you want to jump in before I throw out something?
Well, I was going to say that I feel some of the kinship with Caplan that David was talking about, and also indebted to Mel. I taught a course on Heschel and Caplan last year, and I had Mel come and spoke to the students, and Mel brought up really powerfully the many similarities between the two and talked about Kaplan's writing to Heschel after he reads Heschel's essay from 1942, An Analysis of Piety. And even if I'm not mistaken, included some of that Heschel in Kaplan. Kaplan included some Heschel in his own prayer book. When I became chancellor of JTS back in 2007, I surprised some people who thought that Kaplan was kind of like verboten at JTS by saying that Kaplan and Heschel dialogue in my mind every day, which is not much of an exaggeration. Before I take a stance, I check in with Heschel and I check in with Caplan. I think they're not the same, but they're very complementary, and both of them give you this confidence. This is what David and Nancy were both talking about, that there's something in the Jewish people and in Judaism which almost mystically, beyond an ability to explain it, keeps attracting newer and newer generations of people. You think that you're done and you're not done at all. And it's the openness of the tradition to reinterpretation, or to coin a word, to reconstruction, that I think is part of what attracts people. The fact that Kaplan so stressed Jewish people, and this is one of the most significant concepts in Jewish discussion right now in 2023, we could not do without this concept of Jewish people. You could not explain what's going on in the world, by the way, both among Jews and among anti-Semites, without talking about this notion of Jewish peoplehood. But it's not just Jewish peoplehood. There's a content to this Judaism, to the ideas and how they're constantly being refashioned, or take a Kaplan term, they're being revalued, that attracts people. And if you want to be encouraged about the Jewish future, all you have to do is do what Nancy and David and I do, which is speak to young people who, from more and more diverse backgrounds, keep getting attracted to this project of helping to revitalize Judaism. I can tell you that when I first read this book as a teenager, I loved and responded to this line at the end. It's in the very last paragraph. The Jew will have to save Judaism, before Judaism will be in a position to save the Jew. The Jew will have to save Judaism before Judaism will be in a position to save the Jew. The Jew is so circumstanced now that the only way they can achieve salvation is by replenishing the wells of salvation which have run dry. So you could say this to a teenager, and that might send some people running away, saying, well, there's nothing here for me. Well, I don't have the energy. I don't have the imagination to do this. What am I going to possibly contribute? But there's always going to be a number of people who are going to say, that's a project that I want to join. Yeah. And I can find the meaning of my life, as Caplan said at the very beginning of the book. I can find the meaning of my life, the purpose of my life. I can find my salvation in joining this project. I can tell you this story that I read this aloud to my students at JTS last year when we were studying Heschel and Caplan. And one student in the back row said spontaneously, yeah, I want to do that. Like that's a project that I want to join. And it's this very, paradoxically, this very notion that you have to make a contribution to this Judaism. It's not there in a silver platter for you to just receive as a passive recipient. You have to be an agent in making this Judaism relevant to your generation. And certainly if you're going to be an educator or a rabbi or a cantor, you are responsible for transmitting something, and you're being taught, I think by all of us on this panel, that to do that, you're not transmitting something as you received it, you're transmitting it in a form different than you received it, and only so is it going to live for the next generation, who in turn are going to do that for the next generation after them. So this is a gift that Caplan gave us, as I said, in that very table of contents, which I love so much, where he takes it on. Imagine the ambition and the self-confidence that you need to say, okay, we're going to do this, and all these previous strategies have failed, and I'm going to tell you a better strategy. That's amazing that a person would do that. It's either ridiculous or brilliant, and absolutely courageous. And I credit to him for doing it.
Something that hasn't been brought up yet, which was Caplan's, astonishing commitment to pluralism. It's something that's just so deep and wide, and, you just don't read anybody out. Everybody's in. There's lots of different ways to be Jewish. There's lots of different ways to think about things. I remember when I interviewed Richard Rubinstein, the late God is dead theologian, for my PhD dissertation, and I went down to Washington, D.C., where he was at the time, and he said to me, why do you work for those Reconstructionists? Well, he had a lot of bad things to say about Reconstructionist theology and everything. And then he said, but my article about evil, it was published in the Reconstructionist, because the Reconstructionists, God bless them, they invited me to write an article about what I didn't like about their theology. That really struck with me, that's who we are. We are a people that just are organs of the places where we have literature that we put out in the world. There's a kind of commitment to pluralism that's part of a humility that we really don't know what the future is going to hold. So we have to hold a lot of different ways of going about doing this Jewish thing. And I feel like that's so important right now, because I'm seeing all over the place people saying, oh, those Jews, they're not good Jews anymore. And I'm wondering what you all think of that.
Well, I think that's actually the genius of Caplan. The notion of what's revelatory in Caplan. I think what's revelatory in Caplan, beyond anything, is that he was able to express a degree of optimism that Judaism could respond even as a subordinate civilization in a free, open, democratic, pluralistic society. And that my own sense of the traditional Elena or not aside, the reality is, from a Kaplanian perspective, as we've been talking, it's probably good to have all these options. The amazing thing about the 21st century, and where Caplan gives me a great degree of confidence, is that in the 19th century, where I've done a lot of my academic work, the reality was when Jews intermarried in large measure in the 19th century, they did leave the Jewish people altogether. There are complex reasons for that, but the reality is they abandoned Judaism and the Jewish people. The amazing thing about the end of the 20th and the 21st century is Jews intermarry at even a higher rate, but simultaneously they demand entry and full participation in the life of the community, and that you have a Judaism that may start to use a Rosenzweigian metaphor, when he opened the Lair House, a Judaism that goes from the periphery to the center, not the center to the periphery, as was true with our Eastern European grandparents. But Kaplan, who himself was a product of that Eastern European and early immigrant generation to this country, in his work and in Judaism as a Civilization and in countless other books, Caplan really gives us a way in which Judaism can continue to thrive amidst the plurality of this larger world. And he does so while affirming peoplehood and ethics simultaneously. In other words, how is it that you continue to affirm both particularity and the universality that are inherent in Jewish tradition? There is a great degree of tension. I think many of us feel that during these days in a particularly acute way. But I think in the conversation we had prior to our meeting today, I had pointed out that one of the things that always interested me about Kaplan, he was the first person to actually introduce Hermann Cohen in his book on ethical nationhood to the English-speaking world. Hermann Cohen, of course, was a great German Kantian thinker, a Reformed Jew who focused on ethics as being at the center of Jewish religious tradition. And I remember the first time I read it, I thought, gosh, seems so odd that it would be Kaplan who would bring Cohen's voice to America's shores. But as we're having this discussion today, it seems completely logical to me, and is a testimony to the ongoing legacy and revelation, if one wants to use it, that Kaplan provides us by speaking of Judaism in such broad, inclusive, and accepting terms.
Well, thank you. I'm going through the questions that are being followed and also thinking to all the very rich things that you're saying. So I think I'll throw out something that was in my mind, and also Bob Gluck asked it in his question comment in the chat, which is the whole question of Jewish peoplehood. It's come up a couple of times in the conversation, and as all three of you have said, you do a lot of teaching to people in their early 20s and 30s, and Shaul Magid's message, 4 or 5 years ago was that, Kaplan's conception of Jewish peoplehood no longer can speak to, this post-ethnic generation in which we are living. So if you could, if the three of you could perhaps, flesh that out a little bit, what is he missing, or commentators like him missing, that you're seeing in the students that you're dealing with, and that Kaplan perhaps got right?
Well, I'm gonna speak for myself here, and not for the students, because I don't really know where, I haven't done like in-depth interviews of our students on this one. I think I know who they are, but I'll just simplify it by talking about myself here. I think that Caplan was absolutely right on peoplehood, and Shaul Magid was wrong. Put it that directly. To me, Judaism begins with the moment, or the story of the moment of the covenant at Mount Sinai, and what distinguishes that moment from every other foundation story and every other religion is that we're not just a religion for this reason. A faith is not only the thing that's founded at Mount Sinai, a people is founded at Mount Sinai. There's a covenant people, and this people is instrumental to the foundation of this faith, because the point of this faith is not to believe certain things, but to do certain things in the world, to be certain things in the world. As David said, there's ethical nationhood here. So there's nationhood, but there's also ethical nationhood. Mamlechet Kohanim v'goy kadosh, a holy people. Imagine the idea that a people is going to be called to holiness, not to some chauvinistic, nationalistic ambition, but to holiness, and that's built in. So to me, I don't see, I am not willing to take the risk that after 3,000 some years of going at it this way, of being a people and more than a people, of being a people and an evolving religious civilization, in Kaplan's term, we're suddenly going to say, well, we can scrap the people part, let's just go for the spiritual. Let's just go for the ethical. Let's just be a collection of individuals who bind themselves to a particular ideal. I'm not willing to take a chance on that. Maybe some people are more willing to experiment with the future of the Jewish people. I am not. To me, the Jewish people is precious. And some of the people who are not interested in peoplehood are happy to dispense with a relation to the state of Israel. It just gets in the way. States are messy. They do terrible things, as we see. They commit all sorts of sins. And we're here to be ethical monotheists. We're not here to do that. So let's not get involved with this messy stuff of peoplehood. Let's just say that we're a spiritual path, and that's what Judaism is going to be in the future. And Kaplan rejected that with every bone of his body, and so do I. I think that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. We've got to preserve the people. And therefore, it may turn out that the optimism that David expressed concerning intermarriage is going to hold. I don't think so, but let's see. All right, let's do everything we can to bind as many intermarried families as we can to the Jewish people and to Jewish civilization, and then let's see how it turns out. But to my mind, Caplan was not wrong on this one when he put the emphasis on creating an ethical nation, when keeping us as a very strong group of people. As Nancy said, pluralistic. What people is pluralistic? Who can manage this? What faith is pluralistic? He's calling us to very high ideals. To me, this is Judaism. This is Torah. He was absolutely right about this, and we shouldn't give up. And to my mind, Shaul Magid gives up much too quickly.
Nancy, I'm curious what
I'm losing something in this conversation because I didn't understand peoplehood with the word ethnic in there. The word ethnic peoplehood, I think Shaul Magid was saying that an ethnic peoplehood we may be post, but I don't think he said he was post thinking of us as a people. It's just that the peoplehood is being redefined, and it's not being redefined in terms of who your mother is and who you married, and it's being redefined in terms of how you understand your life as being bound up with the Jewish people's life. But I see a lot of people joining who are different colors and don't want to give up. It's not ethnic anymore in my mind. And so I'm missing the kind of a conflict here between Shaul Magid and Caplan. I'm all for peoplehood. I think that my students are as well. And I think my students are for peoplehood, even when you're saying that they don't like Israel. They don't like Israel, but they don't like it as Jews. They're engaging with Israel as part of the Jewish people, engaging in the conversation about Israel to call it to ethical standards. That's what I call peoplehood. So I might be missing this conversation entirely.
Nancy, I can disagree with people. I feel obligated. There are 7 million Jews there, maybe more. I'm obligated to those 7 million Jews. The way I can express my obligation is say, you're on a wrong path. But no matter what path they're on, no matter how wrong I think it is, I'm responsible for them. I'm connected to them. I can't wash my hands of them. And so that's where a peoplehood differs from a voluntary association. If I agree with you, I'm part of your people. If I don't agree with you, I'm not part of your people. That's why I think Shaul is trying to change the definition of people. Ethnic is a wrong category. Jews.
I heard the word ethnic coming out of Eric's mouth when he said.
Well, but
I apologize.
I'm going to say ethnic the Jews don't work with ethnicity. Ethnicity is not a concept that helps us. And part of the problem is we have to fit ourselves into all these other concepts, like religion. Religion's another one. It doesn't work for us. That's not who we are. And Caplan was strong enough to say that. That's not the concept we need. And similarly with ethnic. And this is, not to get too speculative, but one of the reasons for anti-Semitism, I believe, is that we just refuse to fit into other people's categories. We just won't accept them. We're different. We insist on difference here. And that doesn't make friends.
But Arnie, back to the 7 million Jews that live in Israel. I lost you there. What does that have to do with what I'm saying about peoplehood? People engaging with Israel critically as Jews, but as part of the Jewish people, that's not okay?
Engaging critically with Israel is 100% okay, but there's a lot of people who are not engaging critically with Israel. They're just washing their hands at Israel.
David,
tell me that you haven't heard students like this. I'm a Jew, but I have nothing to do with Israel. It has nothing to do with me. I don't care about it.
I haven't heard that,
as far as I'm concerned. And
I haven't heard that. I've heard people saying that I am a Jew and I'm responsible for this. These are my people. And
great.
Now I want to get into the conversation of what should be going on. But I've not heard that they're just washing their hands.
That's great.
No.
David, if you can chime in.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm enjoying listening to Arnie and Nancy, and I feel a little bit like the Hasidic Rebbe in the house with all the people coming in and like, yes, yeah, I agree with this and I agree with that. Both of you are right. I mean, I think that we have moved away from an ethnic community, and I think our sense of community has expanded radically. I mean, there is an interesting book written in recent years by Noam Pienko, who I believe is a Reconstructionist, from Rutgers University Press. And Noam kind of wants to go beyond peoplehood, a concept that, of course, Rabbi Kaplan was the first one to use that term, I guess in Hebrew, amimut, but that's certainly not a classical Hebrew term. And part of what Noam points to is that, our concept of peoplehood, as Nancy put it, and I don't think there's anything here you disagree with, Arnie, has really expanded. I mean, look, we had half of our people couldn't even speak in the public life of the Jewish people up until recent years. That is to say, women. We don't hear their voices. I always think that, I read this in Heschel once, that the classical word for a human being in medieval philosophy is hamadaber, he who speaks, because the ability to speak was the ability to ethically be part of a community. And that in recent years with Judith Plaskow, Nancy Fuchs Kreimer, Deborah Waxman, I could go on and on, Rachel Adler, human beings have become hamadabrot. I mean, they're the women who speak as well. And in the way that you indicated, Nancy, the community has certainly become more racially and in other ways diverse. What I do think peoplehood means, though, is that as you come to be part of this Jewish community through formal conversion or not, that there is a familial sense of obligation. What I do think is undoubtedly also true is that you do have to recognize that everyone in your family is a relative. And I think those of us in the liberal camp of Judaism have to also be somewhat honest. All those 7 million people, Arnie, and this may be going beyond our particular topic today, they are all part of our family, but you actually aren't obligated to invite everyone in your family to every family celebration or event. Ben Gvir and Smotrich are part of my family. I acknowledge that. But Baruch Goldstein, I don't have to invite him to my party. There is a sense in which the ability, as it were, to give tochecha, I don't think there's anything here you disagree with, Arnie, has to become part of our sensibility. And what we have to avoid is having individuals become completely indifferent. As long as people are speaking in Jewish voices to these issues, I think Kaplan's legacy remains vibrant.
I just wanted to say something because I can't follow all the chat and also speak at the same time, but I did see my teacher, Rabbi Ira Stone, asking why would 15 rabbinical students be important to hear about when you hear about hundreds and hundreds of Jews who've walked away from Judaism. And I want to say that I chose that introduction very specifically because I believe with William James that reality is what we choose to pay attention to. And that I was responding to my teacher, Mordecai Kaplan, and I was responding to his growling polar bear. And I was responding not just to those 15 students, but to the fact that they went to 16 or 18 different organizations that didn't exist when I was in rabbinical school, all of which are dedicated to arts and spirituality and social justice from a Jewish perspective. So they represent a lot more than just those students. There's some significant amount of money and energy and time that's going into building up a Jewish community. And some of these people are ethnically Jewish, Jewish and some aren't. And just one last thing about Israel. I have seen people come to rabbinical school who cut their teeth on critical asking questions about Israel, and they weren't even that Jewish to begin with. And now they've realized that not only do they want to continue to ask those questions, but they want to continue to ask those questions as part of the Jewish people asking those questions. So that's profound in my mind. We are a people, and we are a people that cares about all of us in the world, and we're a people who cares about ethical, universal values and peoplehood thriving. And it's darn hard to balance all that right now with an engagement with the state of Israel. It's really hard. We're living in a tough time. And what I feel so grateful to being a Reconstructionist is that, unlike some of the other listservs I'm part of, and I'm part of quite a few, including some other rabbinical ones, I get to do and speak to people who respect pluralism, because they get what Mel Skult has said to us many times, which was Caplan was a Fabrenta pluralist. So that's what I have to say.
Thanks. I'm going to come in here. I have a quote that if we have time, I'd like to share it towards the, when we're closer to the end than we are now, in which Caplan, in the questions Jews ask, deals with how to navigate when Israel does things that perhaps make us uncomfortable. And I'll put that up towards the end. But the question that I have for all of you is, I'm wondering if you could say more about what you find compelling in Caplan's approach to very specific things, such as to prayer, or his understanding of the place of ritual, the way he approached reinterpreting ritual, the way he approached building prayer for the then 20th century, we could say 21st century, his understanding of the role of Hebrew and the importance of Hebrew in Jewish civilization. And I throw out theology too, but we have said a few things about that. But if you could say a little bit more about to what extent you value or do not value Caplan's specific approach to the specific materials of Jewish civilization, like I said, prayer, Bible, Shabbat. If anybody feels interested in chiming in on that, it would be wonderful to hear what you're thinking.
Will I start? Well, I'll say that I think that Caplan's second most important book after Judaism as a Civilization is The Meaning of God. I think The Meaning of God is an absolutely brilliant book. Absolutely brilliant. And one of the things that I like the most about it is about ritual, because I'm going to be simplistic and put it in my own words and not Caplan's, but I think this is true to what Caplan is recommending. So if you have a ritual and the meaning attached to that ritual is one that doesn't make sense to you, don't throw away the ritual, change the meaning. Change the meaning, because the ritual is where the life is in the quest for salvation, the quest for meaning, and the quest for community. And he recognizes that ritual is a very powerful agent of community and something that human beings need to find meaning in their lives. So don't throw away the ritual because you don't believe in the meaning. Change the meaning. And what he does throughout that book, so obviously a collection of drushas, of good sermons he gave about the holidays. Okay, this is the meaning that I find in Passover. This is the meaning that I find in Shabbat. This is the meaning that I find. God bless Caplan. He finds meaning even in Shmini Atzeret, which no one knows why it's there, but Caplan finds meaning in Shmini Atzeret. I don't like the language of exclusivism. Caplan kind of, Caplan, it's been said before, Caplan was kind of two minds about theology. Sometimes Caplan says, well, if it works for you, that's good. It's a functional thing. I want you to have a concept of God that works for you. But sometimes his intellectual hackles get up and he can't stand the fact that people are saying they believe things he thinks are nonsense. And there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of that in the introduction to The Meaning of God. To the modern man, religion can only mean. But it's not the kind of style one wants to hear Kaplan using, especially because Kaplan is such a pluralist, right? He really should be open to other things, and in fact, in other places he is. So I am not a Kaplanian in my theology. As I've said, I'm much more attracted to Heschel. I think Art Green did us all a major service in this neo-Hasidic rendering of Kaplan, or let's say in showing the affinities between neo-Hasidism and Kaplan. So if you don't have this strident rationalism of the 1920s and 30s, but you have a much more appealing language, Kaplan makes a lot more sense to a contemporary reader. And I think Art Green did us all a great service in that. I personally am not attracted to that either. But in preparation for this talk, I leafed through The Meaning of God again, and I can tell you there are dozens of passages in The Meaning of God which are absolutely brilliant, absolutely courageous, striking, innovative, original, and all of us, I think, would be able to give good talks built around those lines and talk with each other about what they mean. He's speaking, the amazing thing is, the book comes out in the 1930s, and he's speaking directly to American adults of the 2020. How does he do this? How does Kaplan speak so well to those of us who are living 90 years later? I wonder at this. This is like an amazing achievement. Sometimes one wants to, I know Kaplan would not like the word, but sometimes one might think there is supernatural intervention here going on in the genius of Mordecai Kaplan.
If I could say something here, and I speak as someone who's more attracted theologically to Kaplan than to Heschel. Kaplan, and I really stand to be corrected with so many experts here on Kaplan's thought, but in light of the question you asked, Eric, I always think of how Kaplan uses the terms both reevaluation and transvaluation. And if I understand it correctly, and here, Arnie, there may be limits, and Nancy, there may be limits to Kaplan's pluralism. Reevaluation, as I understand it, refers to certain practices in Jewish civilization that really are outmoded and should be rejected, whereas transvaluation is precisely the kind of thing, Arnie, as I understand Kaplan, that you were describing. Namely, you take classical beliefs, practices, rituals, and you provide them with new meaning. I was just reading recently a discussion about the ketubah in classical Judaism, where you have two women on the law committee of the Rabbinical Assembly. One of the women, Gail Leibovitz, argues against ketubah altogether. She feels that it really can't, to use Kaplanian terms, be reevaluated, that it is a classical notion of kinyan, of acquisition, that's involved, and she affirms other modes of ritual marriage that overlap with classical forms of kiddushin, but she sees the classical ketubah as beyond redemption, whereas the woman who's the chair of the RA Law Committee currently, who teaches at Washington University, indicates that why shouldn't we, as conservative Jews, modern Jews, do what our ancestors have done and simply create egalitarian modes of ketubah? Whereas, again, her opponent says that just can't be done, where you have a metaphor like kinyan. Kinyan acquisition is simply a dead metaphor. And I think part of what Kaplan does, Eric, is that he says to us, of course, Hebrew has to be central to an ongoing Jewish civilization. That's the language of our people. Individuals who do not know Hebrew, there is just an impoverishment in terms of access to the classical sources of Judaism and Jewish conversation. It doesn't mean that such people can't participate, but they may not be able to participate in quite the same way that persons who know the classical text of the tradition do, in terms of the ongoing conversation that marks Jewish tradition, even as we move on. But the key point I want to make is that on occasion, it isn't, as it were, a Rosenzweigian not yet to certain elements in our tradition. Sometimes, from my perspective, it really is a no. Attitudes in Leviticus towards gay persons, etc. simply can't be tolerated. I mean, that is to say that statements in our tradition that diminish the humanity of another can't possibly be words of divinity. I mean, that's an axiom with which I begin my reading. Again, Arnie, I'm not sure that you would disagree. I'm just not sure, Eric, in light of the question you ask, and I'm interested to see what Nancy says, that everything can be transvalued. I think there are things that simply cannot be. And I think Caplan, in this discussion, and it's somewhat esoteric, of reevaluation and transvaluation, gives us hermeneutical tools to make those sorts of distinctions.
So I will confess that I really have trouble listening carefully to everything everyone says and reading all the comments in the chat at the same time. Maybe it's just me, but it's a lot of ADD for me. So I'm going to try to do my best. The last time I wasn't reading from the chat, I was talking about pluralism as something to do with people in our community. I know now we've been talking about pluralism, about which things we can evaluate and transvalue and which ones we can't. And I understand that. I don't think I have that much to say about that. But I do have something to say about people in our community because it's such a current issue right now in the Jewish world. And I find so many people writing out other people. And I find it so problematic from a Reconstructionist perspective. And it comes, I didn't talk at the beginning about my own experience, but when I started RRC in 1977, I was on the executive board of an organization called Brera. I was all of 25 years old, but I guess whatever, they needed women. Anyway, I was on that board and I arrived at RRC to discover a editorial by the president of RRC, Ira Eisenstein, saying, "We need a Brera to Brera. Brera is a bad thing." No. And I thought, oh boy, I'm done. I'm done for here. My rabbinical school career just ended and it's only one day old. But no, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Rabbi Eisenstein thought Brera was misguided, that it was way too early to be talking about Palestinian self-determination and we should wait for somebody else to say that first or whatever. I don't remember the details, but he was with the American Jewish community's mainstream that said that was not a good thing to be doing right now. And he always defended everybody in this school has a right to think through where they want to stand, to find their voice. The important thing is intellectual integrity and honesty and being able to have your ducks in line and being able to do it because you truly care about the flourishing of the Jewish people, not because you hate them. And I flourished at Reconstructionist Rabbinical College under Ira Eisenstein's guidance, and that's where my experience comes in.
I guess I'll ask Nancy. The question that I just want to give you a chance to reply to before we move on or start to close off, actually, is just what aspects of the way Caplan would say speaks of prayer, or very specifically speaks of Jewish ritual, or his understanding of the role of Hebrew in Judaism. What of these specific
I would agree very much with what Arnie said, that I find and my students find that Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion is a powerful book. They love that book. The reclaiming of the Jewish holiday cycle is absolutely central to the meaning of people's lives now. And we follow Arthur Waskow and we follow Michael Strassfeld and we follow all the wonderful writing that has been done. And it all starts with this very profound book, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion. So that's what I would give you for that question.
Well, thanks. A couple of times Mel Scult's name has been mentioned, and we have the pleasure of having him on the call. I'd like to give him one of the last words here, both to share some thoughts about the rich things that we've heard from David and from Arnie and from Nancy, and some of your own thoughts on what is compelling, revelatory in Caplan. Why have you spent so much of your life, and thankfully that you have, working on that? So Mel, if you could unmute and share some thoughts.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words and for the mentions that came from the participants. I guess I want to talk briefly about Caplan's mind and what is so wonderful about it and what is so difficult about it. You know that I've spent half a century in the midst of the diary, and I think there is something which I would like to call diary thinking. In other words, in an expository essay, one lays out a particular point of view and argues and gives sources to evidence that point of view. In a diary, one wakes up one day and you say X, and you wake up the next day and you say, I don't believe in X, I believe in non-X. The diary itself is a manifestation of the fact that Caplan in his mind very, very frequently stood on both sides of an issue. And that is most annoying when one comes to the matter of the belief in God, for example, where we want to pin him down. Neil Gilman, about 15 years ago, in a speech I was giving at the seminary, said, is Caplan a naturalist? And the point is, I didn't know what to say. And I think I could answer him much better now, that yes, he is a naturalist, but there are supernatural elements in Caplan's mind. I've even come across a statement, I'm sorry, Arnie is walking away. I even came across a statement where Caplan says he would have the power direct us in a certain direction. What I want to say as an illustration of Caplan's mind fastens on what Nancy has said and what Arnie has said about Caplan and Heschel and so on and so forth. We think of Caplan and his particularity, but he was, as Walt Whitman said, I embrace multitudes. And that's really what I am so impressed with Caplan. In a book called Soterics, which Caplan had translated into Hebrew, Emunah Musad, we find the statement, such is the mutuality of human life that none can be saved until all are saved. We are all our brother's keepers, says Judaism. We are all members of one another, says Christianity. We must be saviors of all things, says Buddhism. The categorical imperative of the moral life is so to love your neighbor that you help them to realize their highest potential. I mean, that just absolutely blows me away and gives me guidance in the current situation. The other example that I wanted to give comes from Caplan in the 1930s. It was 1939, and the white paper had just been issued, and it's restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine, and was such a terrible thing. The Yishuv was up in arms, and Caplan, it's so interesting. He felt the difficulty of living in the Yishuv. He says he had nightmares that he was going to be shot by an Arab. I mean, he felt the attack and the rejection of England and the world community of the needs of the Yishuv. At the same time, and in the same day, he embraces the fundamental importance of reason and the fundamental importance of the sacredness of the individual. In the diary on May 17th, 1939, he says, I still believe that before all Jews, all else, we Jews ought to answer to ourselves the question, so to what end are we Jews for? In the middle of all this problem, he wants to answer in a philosophical way. And then he goes on to say, if it is man's function to assert the right of the mind to exist. In other words, he begins with the general assumption of rationality. That's what's important for everybody. What is it important for Jews? So it is the Jews' function to assert the right of human individuality. And what he means is the sacredness of the individual, of every individual. And that is not a selfish thing. That is the community. That is the world. That means every single person. And that really, for me, that statement of Caplan having the dream of being attacked by an Arab at the same time that he says, yes, everyone, even including the Arabs, have a right to an individual life. Thank you for giving me a few minutes.
Thanks, Bill. Always a pleasure. Before I turn things over to Caitlin and Jeffrey to kind of wrap up our time together, I'll just say as a whole, as I saw this conversation, we heard some very powerful statements about how Caplan as an individual is inspiring. In other words, the types of questions that he asked, the very systematic way, as Arnie pointed out, by looking at the table of contents of Judaism as civilization, that he goes about approaching and thinking about the central challenges, but also a lot of the specific answers that he gives to some core questions, whether it is theology, broadly speaking. There's, we've heard some people who find meaning in it, but even if you don't find meaning in it, you find meaning in parts of what he says, if not in the complete package on that level. So I think if the question that we kind of asked in the title is what remains revelatory, so I think it is both Caplan, the personality, which has been said a couple of times, comes out perhaps most strongest sometimes in the diaries, and also some of the specific answers that he gives to the questions that he raises. I'm not going to put up the quote from the questions Jews ask. I'll have that included in the materials that get sent along with this recording. It is Caplan Center practice. It's our minhag that we kind of, people who are interested, stay online after the formal program finishes and get to interact with each other and if the speakers, if they're still around. So we'll definitely be doing that. But my part here for the moment is done, and I'll turn things over to Caitlin and to Jeffrey to thank our participants and speakers and to close off the formal program.
Facilitation so well. We're so very appreciative, and to all our panelists for sure. It's so interesting that we've heard from very profound Metargamim Kaplan, translators of Caplan who are close to his message, but would feel not quite right if we didn't at least hear Cole Caplan, the voice of Caplan himself. And we have this short 1-minute recording that we're going to put up earlier. We're now ready to share this with you. So enjoy hearing Caplan's voice, always relevant, I think you'll agree. I'm sorry, let me just say, this was at a program, Heschel also spoke, honoring Milton Steinberg at Park Synagogue. And thank you to Mel for passing this on. Caitlin?
All right. Hopefully this works. Fingers crossed.
Okay.
Are we hearing it? No. Okay.
Still not. Okay, Margie had worked on that, but okay. Well, Caplan probably writes somewhere about the importance of being improvisational, right? And rolling with the punches. So we'll try to send that on to you in one of our Caplan Center missiles to you. I would like to talk for just a few moments about the next couple programs that the Caplan Center is offering. And as Jane indicated in the beginning, we are looking at the arc that runs from the 40th Yahrzeit of Kaplan to the 90th anniversary of Judaism as a civilization. So I would like people to feel, shall we say, obligated in a Kaplanian sense to come back and visit us on December 10th when we celebrate. It's during Hanukkah. We call it the gift that keeps on giving. And it's the volume, Judaism as a Civilization, a lecture from our great historian of Jewish life and Reconstructionism, Dr. Deborah Waxman, with comments and response from Dr. Elias Sachs, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Publication Society, one of our sponsors. So please don't miss this. You'll be getting lots of information and invitations. I want to tell you about one other thing, and Margie will help with this. I'm appreciative. We have a very special course that's being offered beginning in early January, going through February, four classes, and it's with Rabbi Lee Friedlander and Harriet Feiner. I think one of them at least is with us. And it comes about because we've now made available, we've taken the initiative of putting on digital files the books that are no longer available from Ira, Creative Judaism, and his What We Mean by Religion. So this is an opportunity to see Kaplan through the creative interpretation of his son-in-law and one of the premier interpreters, Rabbi Ira Eisenstein, Zichrono Livracha. And why this might be important, I'm going to ask Margie's help now and sharing with you 1 minute, only 1 minute, of a clip that comes from an interview Rabbi Jeffrey Eisenstadt did with 4 counselors, graduates of the Camp Havaya program. And in this 1 minute, you hear from Josh Davidson, who has a little bit of yichus. He's the grandson of Sam Kelman, one of the co-founders, really, of Camp JRF. And you'll hear Josh reflecting about how he's changed as a Kaplanian and where the vacuum is in his knowledge and experience. So please listen.
Jeff, we're not hearing the sound.
Yes, I know. Margie, any hint about why that is, or anything we can do about it?
Let me try sharing just computer sound for a second.
Okay, that will do.
Things that you might want to learn about Kaplan.
The biggest thing that I would love is that there be some space to actually study his work, right? Like, I mean, at least as it's been communicated to me, that his writing is a little bit impenetrable at points.
That's it, right. Right. Said right.
Which is hard, but like that's always, I think, the glaring thing is that we got the ideas, but I never really had a ton of exposure to the primary sources. So would be, I think, a cool thing. Like the community, the Victims community in Cleveland started as like a Kaplanian reading group. They were just like reading Kaplan in Jeffrey Schein's, living room or whatever, right? But I don't. That to me is like the biggest one. It's just like what's the door in the least impenetrable of the work to like start thinking about it. That for me would be the coolest.
Thanks, Margie. And if you could bring us back to the image of the class, I'm just going to add to Josh's search for a way to get more deeply into Kaplan. Of course, there's more than one way to do that. But, there's this wonderful Yiddish saying that God sends the refuah, the cure, before the makkah, before the plague. And one cure for us is to view Kaplan deeply through the eyes of Ira Eisenstein, and the brevity, the clarity, and the ability to be simple without being simplistic. That is a great gift of Ira as a reader and student of Kaplan. And you'll have a chance to do that. You'll be able to read creative Judaism and what we mean by religion. And I recommend this to you. You'll be given 7 opportunities. And what I do want to add is that at the request of Lee and Harriet, we're limiting this course to 25 people. So the first 25 people who sign up will be the ones who can take the course. We'll do the recordings and share them with you as well. So this is a wonderful opportunity to increase the accessibility of Kaplan through the works of Ira Eisenstein. We hope you'll take advantage of that. So as Eric indicated, the end of a Kaplan Center webinar traditionally leaves some open time for people to ask yet another question, make a comment that they didn't have a chance yet to put in the chat. So I would ask if you, and this will go on for, we've run a little bit over, it'll go on for 10, 15 minutes at most. Margie has put in the chat room how you register for this aforementioned class. I would ask you to raise your hand. That will be helpful, and that will bring you to where I will see you, and we'll call on some people to add thoughts, questions, what they derive from the webinar, new insights, and please, we'd be very eager to hear from you.
Dan, please go ahead. Oh, you'll have to unmute, Stan. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
We can.
Well, this was wonderful, a wonderful discussion. I learned a great deal, and it was really very insightful and terrific discussion, and wonderful indeed. I do have a question. When I left the board after that time, the JRF, after about 10 years or so of being on the board, we had 110 congregations in Harbor Road. It's my understanding that has not increased. It may even slightly decrease. And my question is, why do you folks think that the message and the movement, which should appeal to a whole new generation because of its connection to the Jewish people and its non-supernatural theology, et cetera, everything that was said, which was a great appeal, it hasn't really grown. Anybody want to answer that?
I guess I would like to say something about the ways in which younger generation relates to Jewish peoplehood and Jewish life. There are many more avenues than synagogues. And so if you're counting congregations, you might not be counting the right thing. You might want to count how many people are looking at our ritualwell.org, which is a website that helps people develop rituals and programs for their life cycles and their holidays. And I'm understanding is that thousands of people log on every month to get their materials. That comes out of Reconstructing Judaism. Or you might want to look at Evolve, where cutting edge ideas are being explored, and people have groups where they talk about these issues. And I just don't know that congregations have quite been the only way in which people have shown their connectivity. That's what I've got right now.
That does get you into your interesting and important conversation about the individuality, individual seeking and the individual, which you might call individual Judaism and communal Judaism, or peoplehood in that sense. Because that's the problem, I think, with people who say, and I've had this conversation with many people who say, I don't really want to join a congregation. I do Jewish, I go do Shabbat, and I do my own Judaism. Okay, well that's a problem. I mean, that's a problem. It's not a communal, and they don't contribute necessarily to the greater community. I mean, it's the same people I talk to sometimes and say, well, that's fine, but what do you do? Do you belong to any Jewish organizations besides? Do you contribute to any Jewish organizations? And what do you do to be part of the Jewish world, the Jewish community? In addition to, of course, I never discourage anybody from being their own individual Judaism, but what do you do in addition to that?
Can I just interrupt for a second, Stan? Because I just saw something that came in from, I think it's Larry Pinsker. This does not obviate the need for rabbis. Let me just be clear. Rabbis getting jobs all over the place working for these organizations. There were rabbis working for Avodah. There were rabbis working for Bend the Ark. There were rabbis working for If Not Now. So I'm not saying we don't need rabbis. And I'm not saying we don't need Jews to do communal things and give money to Jewish communal events. There were rabbis working at queer yeshiva. I'm just saying that it may not be congregations. That's all.
But also, I would like to highlight, and I want to step in and say this because I am a younger Jewish person, and I think sometimes it's hard if you're not in those spaces, that we think, I think this model of joining organizations and being in a physical synagogue is very much a pre-digital, very old, I don't want to say it's old-fashioned, but a lot of these institutions were and are headed by baby boomers. And so it's not surprising that a lot of younger Jews, you're going to be finding them online. You're going to be finding them in denominations that aren't really denominations. Like, for example, Neo-Hasidism isn't really a denomination. It falls partially between what Reb Zalman was doing and what Reb Kaplan was doing. We look at Jew witches. Jew witches is not a thing we hear a lot of baby boomers talking about, but we see a lot of people on Instagram and TikTok that are Jewish talking about it. These kind of mini movements that are going on within Judaism. So firstly, we have that. And then secondly, we have digital spaces instead of physical spaces because of the reality of the pandemic and rural Jews who don't necessarily have access to a community. And then obviously, the third thing is just the needs and the wants of the community have changed. I don't necessarily think young people want to join a sisterhood when we have the whole generational gap in terms of how we approach sexuality and how we approach gender. Joining your sisterhood is not necessarily, as a Jewish woman in the modern age, going to satisfy you. I think, especially if you're a trans woman, you're not necessarily going to feel included in that traditional baby boomer run B'nai B'rith sisterhood at your local synagogue.
So now everyone knows why we are so glad to have Caitlin on our board and to challenge us about whether the message is coming through in the nusach of 21st century Jewish youth. And that is the case. Is there anyone else? That was a rich discussion. If neither Arnie or David, if you would like to respond to that, I'm glad to have you do that. Maybe we should take one more response from the Kahal, someone else who would like to say something, and then we'll be sure to circle back to our panel and to Eric. Anyone else want to share a response to the afternoon or a particular question that the webinar is leaving them with?
I would respond to Stan's question. Caitlin is absolutely right that the younger generation always builds their own institutions. Our generation built Darchei Noam from a very small group now to an established synagogue, and now we're wrestling with the question, as Stan is asking, of how do we maintain that? But so one question is that the younger generation doesn't really wants to be associated, really wants to be Jewish, to learn about Judaism, to practice Judaism, but not necessarily to walk through the doors of a synagogue. And we see that, as Caitlin said, with all kinds of groups, both digital and in person. But the other reason, I think, is that Kaplan was successful. Much of Kaplan wanted to do was to make all of Judaism adopt many of the programs that he espoused. And so if you look at conservative Judaism now and Reform Judaism now, they are very Kaplanian. And so the question that this seminar was about, what is revelatory about Kaplan now, it is essentially based on the idea that much of what Kaplan said has already been adopted by other people. And that leaves Reconstructionism with trying to figure out exactly how we differ and what we bring to the vibrancy of Judaism. I think that this is what Deborah and the college have been very much struggling with too. And I think this is an ongoing problem. Ongoing struggle.
Very good, Mitchell. I want to call on Jane, if it's okay, because I saw her hand was raised. And I just want to make a note, please, that to say that something is revelatory, still revelatory, doesn't say to whom it's revelatory. So if a new bot call has called out to Reform and conservative colleagues, that's fine. It does pose for us the difficult question, if Kaplan is so ingrained in the fabric of North American Jewish life, what's the unique contribution, or have we already made that? I don't think so. But Jane, would you like to say something now?
I would like to defer to Jack and then have a chance to talk. Jack Holofsky wants to.
Okay, and those will be our last two comments. And then I think we actually have this stubborn, ridiculous recording ready to play to end on that note. But Jack, please.
I just want to mention something which I talked to Arnie about when he was in Jerusalem. I guess it's 50 years ago. Caplan had said to me, the Orthodox will be a separate Judaism, will have two functions, and the Orthodox eventually will become like the Karaites. And Arnie did not agree with me at the time. Do you still feel that there will not be two Judaisms? I want to ask him to respond, because you were very adamant at the time it's not going to happen. And I do feel that it will happen. There will be two Judaisms. I cannot find myself in any way being reconciled to all that Satrich and his gang stand for and do and continue to do, and nor with Lubavitch. So I find it very hard. Will you respond? Arnie Eisen and I had that argument.
Then as now, I believe the Jewish people is somehow going to find the wisdom not to be totally self-destructive, and we're somehow going to make it. This is not a rational belief on my part. This is a faith. So someone who I respect said the Jewish people always ends up doing the right thing, but only after trying every other possible alternative, right? And I think that's us, And I take it that there's a chance that Haredi Judaism is going to moderate. It's going to change with the times, and we're going to see what happens. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy, but I believe we're going to stay together.
And David, did you want to respond to that? And then we'll call on Jane and bring this to a close.
I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as Arnie, but I hope he's right. I'll just leave it at that.
Me too. Jane?
Second, David, I was wondering before you move on, if you have any thoughts coming from the part of the world that you're coming from about whether we are at a moment where we're just dealing with kind of an evolution of mechanisms of Jewish community, or whether we're in more of a crisis than that might imply. Well,
I think probably both are true. What I do think about American Judaism, and this may be true of the larger Jewish world, it's only in America that we had these kinds of divisions among liberal denominations. In German Judaism in the 19th century, you had Liberalis Judentums, you had liberal Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. Interestingly, the graduates of the Hochschule of Liberal Rabbinical School in Berlin and the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau all joined the same Jewish rabbinical organization. I mean, there wasn't the kind of division that you have. And quite frankly, even with the Orthodox, when you talk about a sense of peoplehood, Alexander Altmann once wrote an essay entitled "The German Rabbi as a Cultural Type." All of these people were educated in similar ways. They vacationed together. They were quite friendly with one another. I do suspect that the denominational structures that emerged from an immigrant generation and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of that probably will change over the course of the 21st century. And I do suspect you'll have an Orthodox Judaism of some sort and a liberal Judaism much more along the model of the 19th century. Having said that, there will still be considerable diversity, so that I suspect the institutional structures of American Judaism will change as the century progresses. But that here I do agree with my friend Arnie. I do think there will still be an overriding sense of Jewish peoplehood, that even with this division between Orthodox and non-Orthodox, there'll still be an overarching sense of Klal Yisrael, however one would want to understand it. In light of the point that Jeffrey just made, what are the specific contributions that different denominations, including the Reconstructionist one, would want to make? I mean, I'll just say, and I think comment was made by several people, that I'm frankly delighted that Kaplan's influence has been as broad as it has been in all the denominations of liberal Judaism, and that I guess it's up to people who specifically identify as Reconstructionist as to whether that denomination will make singular contributions to American Jewish life. And certainly, as Nancy mentioned, things like ritual well. I know all kinds of Jews who go to that every single day, so that I think each movement will still have important contributions to make, but our institutional structures may look differently in the next 20 to 30 years. And the last line is, as the former president of Hebrew Union, Ani omer kol yom baruch shepatarani. I say every day, I don't know if Arnie would join me in this. I'm glad I'm not the one responsible and can just make comments. I find it's much, much easier to make decisions and offer prognostications when I have no responsibility than when I was in the position that I did.
Thanks, David. Jane, you had the first word. I think we're going to give you the last word here. You have a question or observation?
Thank everyone who put this together and contributed enough. One of the things that I found fascinating was the discussion of Judaism and the Jewish peoplehood as becoming more and more non-ethnic, and the revitalization of Judaism is reflected in our synagogue by more than a half a dozen wonderful people who have chosen to join our community and who didn't grow up Jewish. And of all, we are like a rainbow in our synagogue. And I've heard from Elise Wechterman at the college that they are overwhelmed by requests for people to join. And I think this is something that I would like to explore more, to find out what it is that about us as in the Kaplani and in the Jewish civilization that is pulling people who didn't start out with us to join. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of